Hello and welcome to DiverCity Podcast. My name's Julia Streets. A key part of increasing and extending diversity and inclusion is the need to drive change. On previous podcasts, we've had leaders talk about what needs to change. Today, we explore what drives transformation. I'm delighted to welcome two esteemed guests, each with a journey story to tell, Ghela Boskovich and Samantha Jayne Nelson. Ghela Boskovich has enjoyed 10 fruitful years in business development for core insurance and banking systems. While she was with her last organisation, Ghela founded FemTechGlobal, which is an organisation built on the premise that diverse teams create better results and embracing differences fosters creativity. She was named one of Brummel Magazine's 2016 30 Inspirational Women Innovators and in Innovate Finance's FinTech Power List last year. She is also on the board of the Financial Inclusion Institute. Ghela, welcome.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Samantha Jayne Nelson, who is the Vice President of Risk Engineering in the Global Energy Practice of Marsh. She is the Chair of Pride at Marsh UK Network Group and an active member of Link, the LGBT insurance network. She is widely recognised as a diversity champion, and in May 2017, Samantha received the Diversity and Champion Award at the British LGBT Awards. Samantha, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So, at the beginning of every podcast, we invite our guests to just talk a little bit about themselves. And so I'd like to invite you, I'm going to start with Ghela, actually. I'll start with you in terms of your kind of personal story. So share us in 2 or 3 minutes a bit about your background.
Oh, goodness. So my background is really cerebral in the sense of I came from an regulatory economic background and been working on pricing models for eons. And starting working in technology and understanding some of the pricing impact or modeling impact of technology in terms of architecture and business model structure. Ended up getting into fintech, I guess, technically when it became a hashtag about 4 or 5 years ago. Just because of a curiosity of how one input can change the entire model. And found that there was no real formal study, so it became an exercise in satisfying curiosity through social media and network and learning from other people. And found that having those conversations and having the opportunity to have as many different conversations with as many different people in as many different aspects of fintech actually enriched my world. And I kind of noticed that I wasn't, I was a little bit on the outside in the sense that there weren't a lot of middle-aged crazy women in the field. I mean, there are a bunch of middle-aged women, but they weren't crazy like I'm crazy. So trying to find community and finding a place and making those connections, and was fortunate enough to get involved in a tribe report in 2015 about the number of women in financial services. And I'd been given some bios to read, and I thought I knew half of these women, but I didn't know them all. And oddly enough, I felt like there was this compulsion to get to know them all, that I was missing something fundamental in terms of my education, my understanding, and my ability to even contribute to the industry because I didn't know these comrades of mine. And took up the adventure of forming a network that actually did that for me. And in kind of exploring that avenue, I realized that I couldn't actually exclude anyone, that I needed to know everything from everybody. And the principle that kind of drives me is curiosity is a virtue. It's a moral virtue. And that curiosity needs to be satisfied through as many different sources as possible. And that it was almost my obligation to not only connect myself to those people, but to connect them to others. And I found that through the strength of a network and through the strength of those conversations and sharing those ideas and putting them up for debate, that we all benefited from them, not just commercially in terms of the business that we can do, but actually how we start to think about developing a banking system for people generally, because money is at the root of every single one of our lives in some way, shape, or form. It allows us to move. It allows us to transact. It allows us to communicate. It allows us to share. Money is essential to this. And so how do we create a system that enables everyone to participate in this? Because again, as the water rises and the boat rises, everybody else rises. Mm-hmm. So it really comes down to actually making those connections and building that network. And that's the journey, I guess.
And then building that network, because you went from sort of being in a fully employed job to then leaving that job and making a point of transition where you went, I don't need to take the paycheck anymore. I'm going to set up my own organization. I'm going to set up my own network, and I'm going to make that work not only for the greater good, but actually for me in terms of my career journey. What drove that change? What drove that decision to leave the paycheck behind and go off on your own venture?
Kind of this realization that money grows on trees. And that sounds crazy, but it does. That there would always be an opportunity if I brought something to the table that was rich and that was fruitful and that I gave it generously, that there would be people that could appreciate it and that I could have support in paying the rent or the mortgage or whatever bills were coming, that wasn't an issue. That the security of a consistent salary wasn't as interesting or as important as the security of knowing I could find the next project or engagement, irrespective of its commerciality. So part of it was you hit a certain point where you're like, enough, basta, I'm done.
So there's a lot in there which I'm keen to sort of unpick into, and we will. And in terms of sort of aspects of the emotional side of your journey and the choice of direction, they also kind of taking the leap into the unknown with just the kind of the faith that that there will always be survival out there somewhere. There will be ways of finding a happier future almost, because this is a consistent theme that we're hearing throughout transformation journeys and sort of where people are thinking about kind of we don't quite know what the future looks like, and it can be quite unknown in many regards. But let me at that moment invite you, Samantha, because you have an extraordinary story, which I think is one which is truly inspiring. I would love you to share that with our listeners. And again, there is so much in the parallels that I think will be worth talking about.
Okay, thanks, Julia. People say my story is remarkable. I don't consider it to be particularly remarkable. I was born a long time ago, pre-internet, sort of that information and that sort of togetherness, that interconnectivity that we now benefit from. So I struggled to actually find myself for a lot of years. I was born in the northeast of England, traditional working class Roman Catholic upbringing, and the constraints that come with regard to that. When I was born, I knew I was different. I totally identified internally as female. However, I was identified externally via the experts as male, and really was forced to fit into a box that was stereotypically northern male. This is what the expectation of you is. This is what you need to do. And that's everything that was drummed into me that was so adverse to my own self-belief or my own self-realization of who I was. Unfortunately, as I say, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't the sort of interconnectivity of communities at that time, and I really, really struggled to find myself. Consequently, I progressed down an engineering route, which was, what was before me, as far as my peer group presented, and ultimately ended up working on the oil rigs for a lot of years, wearing a mask, pretending to be something I wasn't. But if I was going to pretend, I wanted to be the best I possibly could at it. I was always very driven. So I ended up managing installations and ended up in a position where, I had 200 guys accountable to me. And for those of you that know the oil industry, it is 99% masculine, very, very macho. And I endeavoured to fit in, but struggled more and more with it, particularly when I got into the sort of more management realm and we were starting to preach the doctrine of authenticity, open door, come and see me if you've got any problems, be yourself. And I was sitting there day after day questioning myself and saying, look, I'm not being myself here. I'm in a trap here. I'm in a trap. And I realised that fortunately, around that time, the internet had come about and I was starting to develop more and more of an understanding of myself, which was removed from my earlier recollections of going to the library and going through the Dewey Decimal Index system to find any reference.
It's not often you get Dewey Decimal.
Not anymore. But I was something of a move. I did manage to negotiate quite readily at one point. And the other source of information, of course, the newspapers at the time. The newspapers at the time, anything that was adverse from the traditional what wanted to be presented as the norm was very much frowned upon. It was always shock headlines and over-dramatized. So I didn't want to be over-dramatized. I didn't want to be the focus of that sort of attention. But ultimately, I did get to a point where I thought, no, I need to do something about this. And I was very fortunate at that point. The offshore installation or the offshore industry that I worked within you work a cyclical rota. So I used to work for 2 weeks and then have 3 weeks off, which is a fantastic rota, by the way. But where I found myself was for the 2 weeks I was away, I was presenting in this very macho management style, coming home and then living as myself, presenting as myself. I'd established contacts through the internet at this phase, and I was really struggling with these two parts of my personality to connect them. It was almost as if I built a wall and I surrounded myself in the work environment and was very, very much just performing, doing what needed to be done, but not letting anyone get close to me. As opposed to when I was at home, I was distancing myself entirely from work and being myself. And that's where I found real joy and real energy in myself. I couldn't think of a way internally of how to sort of connect those two elements. That's basically where fate intervened. And I always tell this story when I'm presenting. At the time, we'd start to get smartphones, and we had the internet, we had various social media streams. And I had my social media stream in my female persona. I had my mobile phone. Obviously, some of the colleagues at work had the number. They did an upgrade to the software, and the service providers thought it was smart to connect your social media page to your mobile phone number. So when you rang people, you got photographs. Your primary photograph. Not many people had my personal mobile phone number, but one in particular who I was very close with, obviously saw my female presentation and my photograph when we were calling one another. They hummed and hawed and weren't sure whether they should approach me and say that, we know, or, people know, you need to be aware of this. Ultimately, she did, and I'm I'm so pleased she did. At the end of the day, she said, "Look, I want you to know not to worry about this, but I need to let you know something." And that's where she said she knew, and it was okay.
Right.
I didn't have to do anything, but she was there for me if I needed anything at all. And that sort of chink that appeared in that wall, that divide between my working environment and my home environment, all the bricks just seemed to tumble down. All of a sudden, I had this light thinking, okay, although I've been taught if anyone ever finds out, I'll lose everything, which is very much what I had been brought up believing. Yeah. All of a sudden, I had someone from my working environment that came to me and said, look, it doesn't matter. We'll be there for you. And she'd already approached the HR, because we had a friend in HR who was the HR director at the time, just to canvass opinion what she should do and what the company would say. And very much the company sided with, look, we're there to support. There's a safety net there. And as soon as there was a safety net there, I thought, what have I been hiding for?
Yes.
Why have I been using all this energy to stop people finding out who I am?
And it is an amazing thing, which is the amount of energy that is wasted on, kind of what people, I mean, you use the words kind of building up your own wall and building up your own kind of framework where you just go, and equally with career paths, where we think that when we set out on a career journey, this is the path it's going to take. Or we set out on a life journey, this is the path it's going to take. And these kind of walls are on these directions and boundaries, if you like, are put up. And a lot of them we put up ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's part of your social conditioning. Obviously, you build up a lot of unconscious bias that's learned from your tutors at an early age. So your own, and I always go back to, I was taught by my parents, I was taught by my teachers, I was taught by priests, the unacceptability of who I was. So it wasn't a wall I built, it was a wall that was proposed to me, and then I assembled because that's what I was taught.
It's actually, Samantha, it's interesting that you bring that up, because it's that notion of things can only look one way.
Yes.
And we're told things should look one way. And there is a notion of what is perfect and what is imperfect, and it's a binary thing.
That's right.
And it's that understanding that those are really, all of that is myth. That what we're taught, what we're told is actually someone's attachment to their perspective. It has nothing to do with reality. It has everything to do with what they want to work, that framework that they want to operate within. But it doesn't say something has quality or something doesn't have quality. It just says, this is the way I feel comfortable seeing the world, and I'm going to superimpose it on you. And I mean, I remember breaking away from my parents' constructs and their belief systems many times over, and finding that each time I broke away from that, like, here are the commandments, follow these commandments, whether or not they're coming from the clergy or they're coming from your parents or they're coming from your instructors. It was that every time I broke the rule, the world didn't end, and I didn't end, and I didn't shatter. But it's that notion of this is the way it has to look, and I can't look any other way. And when you get to that moment, I mean, actually, what did that moment feel like when you realized, screw this, I could look any way I wanted to look?
Yeah, I think that's it's such a point of realization, having been self-confined for so long. And you're right, it's a feeling that's superimposed upon you, and you want to belong. I think the human condition is you want to belong.
Absolutely.
You want connections, and you build this barrier thinking, having been taught and believing if that barrier falls, I'm going to lose all my connections, all my livelihood, everything that I have. But once you have that chink, and once you take that step, and once you develop a greater understanding yourself and who you actually are, and are willing to step over that threshold, it's a brand new day. It is so energizing, and the pressure and the weight and then the energy that you use to maintain those barriers, strip that away, and all of a sudden you have an entirely new perspective on life, and it brings with it so much joy. Or certainly in my case, it did. It was almost as if I'd been born again. All those things I stopped myself from doing because I was so terrified of someone seeing me. Once I presented as myself, the world my oyster. I mean, honestly, I travel around the world now with my job. I'm so fortunate, visiting so many fabulous places, meeting so many fabulous people, seeing different cultures, how interacting in so many different environments that going back 15 years, I wouldn't have considered it. I wouldn't even, I wouldn't have known it was possible now.
Because somebody put the expectation on that there was a limit. So this is interesting because I always wonder about accepting self first or accepting others first. And so I talk a lot in terms of how to network with people and what my ethos is on networking. And it's never about me. And in fact, I was in New York last week having the most odd conversation around my perception of somebody and his discomfort and how I perceived his discomfort. And he said, your personality changed from the first time we met. You were very funny and you were ready to spar, and it was just, rapid fire, this, that, and the other. And you're actually really, really calm and quiet. And I'm not quite reconciling. I don't get this. This isn't the person that I met. And I said, what's interesting is when I met you where you were. And I knew you needed that. I knew that was a self-defense mechanism. That was something that you needed to be funny. You needed to seem, like you were in control. I'm totally happy to meet you there. Now that you've relaxed into who you seem to be, you're seeing who I am. But the thing is, I accepted you from the get-go. I gave you what you needed. And I don't need anything other than for you to feel comfortable. In fact, my need is for you to feel like you can be who you are in front of me and know that I just appreciate that you're willing to interact with me, because what I want most is the connection. Mm-hmm. Whatever form that comes in, I'll work to get the connection. And it's an interesting thing that when I stopped saying, I need to be accepted, and kind of turned it around and said, no, I need to make sure that other person knows that they're accepted, it fundamentally changed the way I was able to navigate every aspect of my life.
As soon as I knew there were allies there, as soon as I knew I had support, I think I was at a phase in my life where I was desperate to do something. As I said, I felt constrained. I really needed that wall to be deconstructed. I was struggling between the two parts of my personality. When it came down, I'd always been an advocate for diversity streams anyway, because I knew what I was hiding, and I didn't want other people to be hiding it. But I wasn't as vocal about that. I was in a working environment, predominantly masculine. I was pushing to get females into the engineering sphere. I saw that as being a bit of a mission for myself. Yes, indeed. But then once the mask came down and I was actually able to present myself, going back to the energy that brought, all of a sudden it opened my eyes and started me thinking about various other diversity strains that I hadn't had any real involvement with or any real engagement. And once I started looking at, okay, how can we get everyone around this table? How can we look towards bringing equality to everyone? Mm-hmm. I mean, ultimately, I don't want anyone to be sitting in the situation I was, where they're confined by this wall and not able to express and be themselves, because there's nothing more important than this life than to be able to present, be able to be yourself, have your own opinions, and have people listen to them.
So I call that witnessing. Yeah. I almost call the purpose of our own lives is to witness others. And I say this often. My job is to witness you as you are and as you want me to see you. And when I do that, I fulfill my responsibility as a human being. And that all I ask in return is that you witness me as I am. And that is the social contract that we have with one another. And it's a place of non-judgment. It's a place of neutrality. It's a place of pure equality, because it doesn't have any of this framework Like there's no expectation on it. It's you or you, and I see you and I see you. And I get the privilege of respecting you as a human being. Now, whether or not we choose to interact afterwards, or what kind of business arrangement we have, or what kind of friendship we have, that's a different thing. But you, as you, that has to be pure. It has to be a perfect respect. And that's witnessing. And that's an interesting notion that I think we really kind of forget day to day, is the moment we're almost obligated as human beings just to witness one another.
And I think this is very interesting because we're seeing a tip at the moment around, we talked about unconscious bias, and we talked about sort of diversity and inclusion sort of within organizations. And when we talk about sales and leadership and emotional intelligence, or EQ, that this is something it's becoming the latest buzzword. But this is exactly how, when you break that down into what does that really look like, the witnessing piece is incredibly important, because that's, people go, yes, I get it, and I understand it, and I will work on it. But actually, it's only when you really positively understand the impact of witnessing that you can have a much, much better engagement with the employee who's sitting there going, I want to turn up at work every day just being me, and actually to my soul, right down to my soul, and in every way. I'm very interested in kind of along that journey is have you and for both of you, actually, because Ghela, you talk about your network, and Samantha, you talk about, kind of your journey with the support that came immediately, kind of when you needed it, is and actually when you're traveling around the world as well, is where do you see your support networks come? Are there some that have surprised you, people who have just come out of the blue, or are there some you'd expect, such as your corporate structures? Are there networks and support infrastructures or individuals that have cropped up?
I think yes. From my perspective, I came through a number of years ago. I transitioned. At the time, it was fairly novel. It certainly wasn't as popular as it seems to be becoming all of a sudden, which isn't a bad thing. It's power for what has been done, visibility-wise. But at the time, I found myself interacting with a lot of HR professionals and asking questions with regard to, okay, why aren't we doing this? How can we do this better? Which was good from one respect, because I was there at the concept of a lot of the stuff that was put in place. As I've progressed through my career, there's always been individuals who've been particularly passionate or interested in getting people around the table. And I seem to have been very fortunate to interact with those individuals, whether they've come to me or I've gone to them, and made the connections just because I can see the positive energy that they carry. So together within organizations, we very much driven the idea of getting everyone around the table. That engagement piece is the very first step. And I think we're in a very important moment at the moment as a society, certainly within the financial services, where we are all starting to talk about this now. Mm-hmm. Now, as you say, talking is one element. Mm-hmm. It's an entirely different one. So that education piece that comes around, okay, once you've got the piece, sitting around the table, you've engaged. How do we educate one another? How do we listen to one another? How do we communicate? Mm-hmm. How do we breed that empathy, build the understanding, the witnessing of one another, and not just the witnessing, but the support, giving each other that support.
And it comes in so many different forms. I think it's interesting. It goes back to the listening, actually, when you talk about the support structure. It came from the people I listened to, not from those that were listening to me. Yeah. That's the interesting thing. It was when I, again, made it outwardly focused, when I said, I'll listen to what you have to say. I'll fully witness you, but I'll listen. And I'll actually try to understand exactly where you're coming from, the empathetic part. That those are the people that showed up for me in ways that surprised me. And I am still surprised. It sounds funny to say I'm gobsmacked when someone offers to connect me to somebody else, or that they do something above and beyond what I've asked, because I couldn't conceive of asking for the stars. I only asked for the sand. And the support comes from those that I was being generous with my time and attention to, not the other way around. It sounds an odd thing to say, but at the same time, it's that notion of how do we build the muscle to do it? And then how do we actually start putting it into practice? Water rises to its own level.
And actually, in our first podcast, Justine was talking about actually the various muscles used for leadership, and that was absolutely one of them, was the power of listening as well. And actually, my sort of commercial hat on, when I think about sales teams and leadership and how organizations drive change. For me, it always comes back to a very central premise, which is people do business with people they like. And if you've got that connection with all of this we've been talking about today, if you can build that connection, then you're going to have a much, much more powerful and productive business relationship.
Well, you're talking about sales. Sales only happen when you can actually solve a problem. And you can't solve a problem unless you know what that problem is. And how do you know it? You know it by listening and actually listening to the stuff that's not being said.
So, ladies, what we're going to do is we're going to take a moment there, actually, when I'm going to invite Cynthia and Robert to share some research that they found in the industry.
The 2017 Workplace Equality Fact Sheet, with research carried out by Out and Equal, stated that transgender people face double the rate of unemployment as the overall population.
Nearly half of transgender people were not hired, were fired, or were not promoted due to their gender identity. 9 in 10 transgender employees experienced harassment or mistreatment on the job, or took steps to avoid it.
And for transgender employees, in 2002, just 3% of Fortune 500 companies had non-discrimination protections that included their gender identity. But today, 82% include gender identity in non-discrimination policies.
One of the things I'm really interested to explore, because these are very positive stories, and what's great is we're talking about everything from the kind of experiential to the practical to the commercial, about why this matters in business, leadership, sales, etc. But it's not always rosy. So along the journey, somebody will have an opinion that you don't necessarily appreciate, expect, or in fact favor. And I'd like to sort of take some time to think about, how do you deal with that? How do you plan for it, prepare for it, roll through it? Samantha, along your journey, and I know that you mentor and support lots of other people as well, right the way across the diversity inclusion spectrum. Do you talk about this very much?
I do. I come from a slightly different perspective. I obviously, as we've mentioned, went through my journeys, had problems through my educational system, through my parents. I still don't talk to my parents. I speak to my mother. I'm not allowed to speak to my father. So there's problems that are incurrent with that. It's not where I want to be. And it's something you have to deal with. You deal with it through getting to know yourself and knowing the value of yourself. Mm-hmm. So anyone who positions any negativity upon you, I am very much of the opinion, everyone's entitled to an opinion. Whether I listen to that opinion or not, an entirely different matter, I would add. Now, I've been on both sides of the table. I've sat round tables with groups of men drinking, being boisterous and expressing their true feelings about a number of issues, obviously presenting in a completely different way to how I present now. And some of the things I heard at those points were terrible. And I wished I'd had the strength of character to stand up and actually try and make a difference at that point. But I was so concerned about holding my mask up and protecting myself that I didn't. I shied away into the corner. And I think one of the learnings, one thing I always discuss going forward, is if people are there around a table and they hear things being said that the hairs on the back of their neck are going up and thinking, oh, I should really say something. It's so much more powerful if those people who are directly impacted by it actually step up and say that's not right. Mm-hmm. So that allies piece is so important to remove the negativity, because it is about developing understanding, about educating, about supporting one another. I'm fortunate. I travel the world and surprisingly, although I had a huge fall and was terrified of it falling down, that I was going to lose everything, now that I go everywhere by myself, I actually can hand on heart say I've never, ever felt any negativity. Whether that's because I'm so surrounded by my own happiness bubble or not, I don't know. But yeah, I couldn't be happier. And you might get the odd glance when I first go into a seminar or an event. I mean, I was recently over in Indonesia and there was a big event I was talking at. There was about 200 people there. I wandered in. You could see when I first took to the stage and first started talking, there was a raised eyebrow or a glance, or something's different here. Mm-hmm. It's out of our norm. But once you start discussing about a topic you are aware of, whether that's from a technical aspect, which this one actually was, engineering, or whether it's something to do with diversity, once you engage with people and people sort of develop that understanding, those barriers fall down. Yes. People have that understanding, and that's what we need to do. Just talk. Yes. Just educate and just empower people to support as allies.
Yeah, the ally bit is absolutely important. Strength in numbers. And especially the people that aren't affected. I mean, again, it's witnessing others too. It's not just witnessing the person in front of you, but it's witnessing the experience and the economy of interactions of others.
Yeah, I think that's the tightrope we all try to walk at this. We're on the vanguard of a lot of change, or certainly what I'm trying to do, role modeling, supporting various diversity streams. Within organisations, you very much have a network. You have the millennials coming through who really see this. They don't see it as being an issue. Mm-hmm. You've got ourselves who've been pushing agendas for too long, really, and have made progress, but you always feel, although the upper echelons of organisations get the facts and figures and can see the value of it, whether they actually believe in the value of it's another thing. But then that frozen middle section, that middle management, that the generation you were speaking about, so they're in that stage of their career where they've developed and they've got control over people's promotions, over hiring, and really they're setting their own ways. And actually breaking into that middle section is the most difficult thing to do. And we must be careful not to alienate them. I think that's the important thing to get across. It's how we communicate correctly with them and bring them on board.
And have there been any in that middle that you talk about? Have there been any areas that have really surprised you in terms of where certain behaviours that you thought were entrenched in, old school practices, and actually somebody's eyes have been lifted? Can you talk about some of the triggers that have done that, or some evidence around that?
Yeah, I think just speaking from a personal perspective, I've been fairly visible for a number of years now. Certainly since I've come down to London, I've worked in the financial area. And I was always worried of that transit from where I was comfortable from an engineering perspective working offshore to coming somewhere different and presenting 100% as myself without anyone knowing my background. And there were comments made and a bit of confusion when I first came into the organisation. They weren't sure about risk assessments for me going overseas or how that actually stood legislation-wise, which is a bit strange.
And is that something that people are looking at now? They're really kind of consciously...
It's something they look at. I tell them not to worry too much about it because I go anywhere regardless. That's my
I can imagine that.
That's my approach. But people were concerned about that, which is fine. It was the unfamiliarity with the situation. So that got people, got people thinking, which I thought was fabulous, and they were willing to engage and discuss it. And I think just starting that dialogue allowed people to better understand the situation. They all standoffish and think, oh, not quite sure what to do. But actually engaging and talking one-to-one, you suddenly found what could be perceived as the frozen middle. Parts of it were starting to thaw and think, oh, she knows what she's talking about. Oh, she's all right. We'll listen to her. And once you get those pockets thawing, what a difference it makes having representation through that part of the organisation. There's still people that are uncomfortable with it, not sure what terminology to use. And that's across the entire diversity spectrum. That isn't just LGBT by any means.
Yeah. In fact, we were talking to Head of Millville about this very topic.
So they use what they see as being politically correct, and I hate that term, but they'll refer to D&I, or they'll refer to issues, or they'll refer to agendas. And it's not, at the end of the day, it's all about us being human beings, about achieving, the best we possibly can for one another. Recognizing in yourself that what you bring to an organization. You were talking about sales and products. I think your main product is yourself.
It is your unique selling proposition is you.
It is.
And ladies, I think that's a perfect note to end the discussion on today. It's been wonderful. We could talk for a long, long time, but Samantha and Ghela, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.
This episode of DiverCity Podcast was produced by me, Kieran Yates, on behalf of Julia Streets Productions. Thanks to Cynthia Akinsanya and Robert Pinto Fernandez for their insights. You can find out more about the guests on this week's show on our website, DiverCityPodcast.com, and that's diversity with a C, not an S. Whilst you're there, you can also sign up to our newsletter for all our latest updates. To be sure of catching all our future podcasts, subscribe to our feed in iTunes or your favourite podcast app. And if you've enjoyed this episode of DiverCity, remember to give us a rating or review in iTunes. It all helps promote the show to a wider audience. Finally, our Twitter handle is @DiverCityPod. Thanks for listening.